Hi, welcome to Creepy Crime Cases. On today's episode, we will be covering a killer by the name Kelly Cochran, aka the Devil Woman. I want to personally welcome you to today's episode. Thank you for your time. I will be seeing you at the end. Iron River, Michigan. A town surrounded by forests so thick, the trees seem to swallow sound. It's the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, where neighbors wave as they pass, and where quiet evenings are the rule, not the exception. But on an ordinary October day in 2014, a man simply vanished. No argument. No public scene. One moment he was there, making plans for the next week. The next, he was gone. Chris Regan was a familiar face in Iron River, Michigan, a small community where people tended to know each other's routines. At 53 years old, he had built a life that blended work, friendships, and a quiet sense of independence. Regan worked at the local manufacturer Oldenburg Group and was respected as a reliable, detail-oriented employee. His friends described him as disciplined and straightforward, the kind of person who kept commitments and never disappeared without explanation. It was October 2014 when his absence first raised concern. Initially, it was subtle, a missed day of work, a phone call that went unanswered. But when 2 days passed without contact, those who knew him began to sense a serious problem. In a town like Iron River, where people's patterns were as predictable as the seasons, such a break from routine was alarming. The Iron River Police Department was no stranger to missing persons reports, but most cases in the area resolved quickly: a miscommunication, an unexpected trip, or an illness. Chris's case was different from the start. His employer reported him missing after he failed to show for several shifts without notifying anyone. This was entirely out of character, and the urgency increased when a friend told officers that Regan had mentioned plans to meet someone the night he vanished. Officers were dispatched to conduct a welfare check at his apartment, a modest place he kept neat and orderly. Inside, they found no signs of forced entry or a struggle. His belongings were in place, his vehicle parked outside. But his cell phone was missing, and so were certain personal items he was known to keep on him: his wallet, identification, and keys. Investigators began reconstructing his last known movements. Records showed that he left work on the afternoon of October 14, 2014. Co-workers said he appeared normal, in good spirits, and made no mention of unusual plans. Yet, later that day, he failed to meet a friend for a scheduled arrangement. That absence became the first definitive break in his timeline. Detectives checked phone records, hoping for clues, and noted that his cell activity stopped abruptly that same evening. No calls, no texts, and no location pings after 8 p.m. This sudden digital silence added weight to concerns that something had happened to him, and that whatever it was, it had occurred quickly and decisively. The community response was immediate. Flyers were printed with his photo and physical description, distributed around town and posted online. Residents volunteered to help search the surrounding areas, including wooded trails, fields, and the edge of the nearby Ottawa National Forest. These searches yielded nothing: no discarded items, no footprints, nothing. The absence of any trace was unsettling, and for detectives, it meant they were dealing with a disappearance that left no obvious trail. Detective Laura Frizzo, the Iron River police chief at the time, took a personal lead on the case. Known for her thoroughness and persistence, she began conducting interviews with friends, co-workers, and anyone who might have seen Chris in the hours before he went missing. A few leads emerged, but none were solid. Most people remembered nothing unusual, except for one detail from a close acquaintance. Chris had been seeing a woman socially, and there were hints that the relationship was complicated. Her name is Kelly Cochran, and she would soon become a central focus in the investigation, though at this point, it was simply one of many names on a growing list. While leads were still thin, Frizzo ordered a deeper background check on Regan, combing through financial records, bank statements, and recent transactions. It was immediately apparent that there had been no activity since the day he vanished. His bank card remained unused, there were no ATM withdrawals, no credit charges, and no paycheck deposits had been moved. For investigators, this suggested that he either could not access his accounts or was no longer alive to do so. It was a grim but necessary consideration in the early days of the search. Physical searches intensified. Law enforcement coordinated with neighboring agencies, including the Michigan State Police, to deploy tracking dogs and aerial units. Helicopters scanned the dense forests and rural roads leading out of Iron River, but the vast, heavily wooded terrain made the work challenging. Every potential sighting called in by the public was investigated, but each ended in disappointment. The absence of any physical evidence kept the case in a frustrating standstill. As the first week passed, suspicion naturally began to turn toward the people closest to Chris. Friends and acquaintances were questioned repeatedly, their alibis checked and rechecked. Some mentioned that Chris had been planning to relocate soon, possibly to start a new job outside of Iron River. This plan, however, did not fit with his sudden disappearance. If he had intended to leave, he would have told someone, made arrangements, or at least taken his belongings. The name Kelly Cochran surfaced again during these interviews. She was described in varying ways: friendly, unpredictable, and private. What stood out most to detectives was her marital status. She was married to Jason Cochran, a man who also lived in Iron River, and there were rumors that her relationship with Chris Regan was not entirely secret. In a small town, such details often traveled quickly, and while gossip was not evidence, it provided investigators with a potential direction to explore. At this stage, Cochran was simply someone they might speak to, but that conversation would become far more important in the days ahead. Meanwhile, the search area widened. Law enforcement scoured rural properties, abandoned structures, and remote back roads, operating under the assumption that if foul play was involved, any evidence might have been concealed in these less trafficked locations. Despite the scope of the search, every lead returned empty. The lack of physical clues was becoming one of the defining challenges of the case. For detectives, it was not just about finding Chris Regan, it was about finding even the smallest indication of where to look next. By the end of October, the missing person case had shifted from a standard search to an open-ended investigation. Chris Regan had effectively vanished without a trace. His friends, his co-workers, and even casual acquaintances were left with the same questions. Where had he gone, and why had all contact stopped so abruptly? For the Iron River Police Department, the urgency was now matched by a growing sense of pressure. In cases like these, time was not just a factor, it was often the deciding element between finding a person alive or uncovering a crime scene. What no one knew at that moment was that the answers would lead them into a tangled web of personal relationships, hidden conflicts, and eventual confessions that would shock investigators. But in October 2014, all they had was a missing man, a blank space where his last movement should have been, and the beginning of a case that would span multiple states and reveal a series of events darker and more complex than anyone in Iron River could have anticipated. In small towns like this, a missing person case wasn't something that came across an officer's desk every day, and when it did, the stakes were high. The department began with the basics: checking Chris's known addresses, contacting his friends and colleagues, and canvassing the areas he frequented. Officers visited his apartment, noting that his vehicle was still parked outside. The car's presence was a red flag. For someone to leave without their vehicle, especially in a rural area, was unusual and often signaled that the person had not left willingly or had met with trouble. Inside the apartment, the scene appeared orderly, but there were subtle details that caught the attention of investigators. Items of daily use, keys, wallet, and personal effects, were still in place. This suggested that if Chris had left, it had been abrupt, with little to no preparation. His reputation among colleagues was one of reliability and consistency. He wasn't the type to disappear without notice. This added weight to the growing suspicion that something was seriously wrong. Friends recalled that Chris had mentioned a relationship with a married woman, though he had been discreet about the details. That detail, though small at first glance, would soon become central to the investigation. The connection between Chris and Kelly raised eyebrows in the department. Small towns run on information, and word of their association had circulated quietly. The implication that Chris may have been involved with Kelly added a potential motive to his disappearance, one tied to personal relationships and possible conflict. Officers decided to approach Kelly for a statement. In their first contact, Kelly presented herself as cooperative. She admitted knowing Chris and acknowledged that they had been friendly, but she downplayed the extent of their relationship. She claimed to have last seen him casually and didn't recall anything unusual about their interaction. To investigators, her tone was calm, perhaps too calm for someone being questioned about a missing acquaintance. Still, there was no concrete evidence tying her to any wrongdoing, so she was not treated as a suspect at this stage. Meanwhile, search efforts continued. The Iron River community was engaged, and tips began to trickle in. Some were vague, others impossible to verify. Each lead was followed, but none brought investigators closer to Chris. Police also interviewed Jason Cochran. His reaction to questions about Chris was detached. He claimed to know of Chris but said they had no personal connection. To officers, Jason appeared guarded, measuring his words carefully. While his demeanor wasn't enough to warrant immediate suspicion, it added to the quiet unease building in the investigation. Detectives knew that interpersonal tensions often played a role in cases like this, and the overlapping relationships in this triangle were now firmly on their radar. As the days passed, the case began to strain resources. Officers were juggling routine duties with the demands of the search. They continued to keep Chris's case in the public eye, hoping someone might come forward with new information. From the outside, the Cochran marriage appeared unremarkable, the kind of relationship that didn't draw much attention in a small community. Kelly and Jason Cochran had been together for years, living in a modest home not far from the center of Iron River. Neighbors knew them in passing, cordial enough, but never especially open about their personal lives. The couple kept to themselves, and for the most part, their marriage existed outside the view of the town's social fabric. But as investigators began to look closer in connection to Chris Regan's disappearance, cracks in that picture began to show. The first clues came from acquaintances and co-workers who described Kelly and Jason's relationship as tense and uneven. While arguments are not unusual in long-term marriages, there's had a particular undercurrent that caught the attention of police. Friends hinted at volatility, moments of open frustration between them. Some spoke of Jason's controlling nature, while others described Kelly as someone who seemed restless, sometimes eager to seek connections outside the marriage. None of this was hard evidence, but it painted a backdrop investigators could not ignore. Officers revisited both Kelly and Jason for additional conversations. In these interviews, Kelly's demeanor shifted subtly from her initial cooperative front. She was still willing to talk, but her responses grew more guarded when the subject of her marriage arose. She admitted that things had been complicated, but insisted that she and Jason were committed to working through their issues. Jason, in contrast, was careful and deliberate in his answers, steering the conversation away from any personal disputes. He presented himself as a husband, simply trying to manage the stress of a missing person investigation that had somehow intersected with his life. As the days turned into weeks, detectives began piecing together a more detailed picture of the Cochran household. They learned that Kelly had, in fact, been romantically involved with Chris Regan. This wasn't speculation. It came from multiple sources who had either seen them together or heard Kelly speak about the relationship. The revelation was significant. It meant there was now a clear personal link between Chris's disappearance and the Cochrans, one with the potential for deep emotional and psychological friction. Technology played a role in advancing this line of inquiry. While Chris's phone had gone silent, records from Kelly's phone told a different story. Text messages between her and Chris suggested a familiarity that went beyond friendship. The tone of their communication revealed not only affection but also secrecy, plans to meet privately, exchanges that hinted at an awareness of the risks they were taking. Jason's name never appeared in these messages, but the subtext was clear: the relationship was being hidden from him. When confronted with the evidence of her involvement with Chris, Kelly maintained that it had nothing to do with his disappearance. She framed it as a personal matter, unrelated to the investigation. Jason, when asked directly, claimed ignorance. He said he hadn't known about the affair until the police brought it up. Detectives noted that his reaction was muted, lacking the surprise or anger one might expect, but they couldn't read too much into a single moment. People process information differently, and in the pressure of an interview, emotions are not always a reliable measure of truth. Still, the connection between the three of them was now undeniable. It shifted the direction of the case. Detectives began to consider the possibility that Chris's disappearance was not random, not the result of an accident or an opportunistic crime, but instead tied to deliberate actions within a tight circle of people. The challenge was finding proof, something that could move the case from theory to evidence. The Cochran home itself became an area of interest. Officers visited on multiple occasions, each time with an eye for anything that might stand out. The house was tidy, with nothing overtly suspicious in plain view. Yet investigators knew that if something had happened to Chris there, it wouldn't necessarily be obvious. Any meaningful search would require a warrant, and for that, they needed more than suspicions and circumstantial links. While the marriage was not the only focus of the investigation, it was becoming the most compelling. Every new detail about Kelly and Jason's life together, every timeline cross-checked with Chris's last known movements, seemed to bring the story closer to a central point. The difficulty was that both Kelly and Jason were adept at keeping their narratives aligned just enough to deflect deeper scrutiny. In the background, the pressure on law enforcement was growing. The community wanted answers, and with each passing week, the window for finding Chris alive narrowed. Behind closed doors, investigators began discussing potential scenarios. Was this a crime of passion? A confrontation that escalated unexpectedly? Or had something been planned in advance, carried out with enough precision to erase nearly all traces? The answers remained elusive, but the focus was tightening. By the end of that phase of the investigation, the Cochran marriage was no longer just a side note in the case. It was at the center. The link between the missing man, the woman who admitted knowing him intimately, and the husband whose reactions didn't quite fit the expected patterns was too strong to ignore. What remained was the task of breaking through the carefully constructed walls that Kelly and Jason had built around their personal lives, walls that might be hiding the truth about what had happened to Chris Regan. The first step was securing the necessary permissions. A search warrant, supported by the growing body of circumstantial evidence, gave officers the legal grounds to enter and examine both the Cochran residence and other sites they frequented. The search was methodical. Law enforcement teams spread out, each assigned to a specific grid. The work was slow, deliberate, with every overturned rock or disturbed patch of soil documented. In a case like this, speed was the enemy. Haste could destroy fragile evidence. They cataloged everything: foot impressions, broken branches, even seemingly insignificant scraps of material. Inside the Cochran home, the approach was equally precise. Each room was photographed in its original state before anything was touched. The officers paid particular attention to the garage and basement, areas often overlooked during casual visits. In the basement, one officer noticed what looked like faint staining on a section of the concrete floor. It was irregular in shape, slightly darker than the surrounding surface. A presumptive test for blood was carried out on site, producing a reaction that suggested it could be biological material. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough to warrant further analysis at the lab. The search extended to digital evidence as well. Computers, external drives, and mobile devices were seized for forensic examination. Detectives knew that in modern investigations, a suspect's digital footprint can reveal as much as a physical crime scene: patterns of communication, deleted files, location data. Analysts began combing through these devices, looking for anything that might link Chris Regan to a specific time and place after his disappearance. Back in the field, one of the search teams made a significant find. In a wooded area roughly 2 miles from the Cochran property, partially obscured by leaves and branches, they discovered a piece of metal consistent with a firearms magazine clip. It was rusty but not beyond recognition. While its origin was unclear, the possibility that it had been discarded intentionally couldn't be ignored. Nearby, officers located a scrap of fabric, weathered and torn, that bore some resemblance to clothing Chris was known to have worn. Both items were carefully collected and logged. Forensic analysis began almost immediately. The stains from the basement were tested in a controlled environment. The results confirmed the presence of human blood. DNA testing would take longer, but the initial confirmation alone shifted the investigation's momentum. Meanwhile, the fabric found in the woods was compared against photographs of Chris's clothing. While not conclusive, the similarities were striking enough to keep it in the chain of evidence. As this process unfolded, the team reviewed phone records once more. This time, the focus was on cell tower data. The analysis revealed that on the day Chris was last seen, both Kelly's and Jason's phones had pinged off a tower in close proximity to the wooded search area. The timing of these pings aligned within a narrow window, one that overlapped with the last known movements of Chris. It was a detail that neither Kelly nor Jason had mentioned in prior interviews. Detectives returned to the Cochrans with questions about these findings. Kelly was evasive, suggesting she couldn't recall the exact circumstances. Jason claimed they might have been running errands or driving through the area. But as the investigators pressed for specifics, both responses began to sound less like recollection and more like deflection. The lab results finally came back. The blood from the basement matched Chris Regan's DNA profile. It was the first concrete, irrefutable link between the missing man and the Cochran property. This was no longer just a missing person case. It was now officially treated as a homicide investigation. The discovery changed the tone of every subsequent interaction with Kelly and Jason. Armed with this evidence, law enforcement began piecing together a plausible sequence of events. The working theory suggested that Chris may have been lured to the Cochran home under the pretense of meeting Kelly. At some point, violence occurred, resulting in his death. The basement, once just another room in the house, was now considered the likely primary scene of the crime. From there, the body and related evidence would have been moved, possibly to the wooded area where the fabric and firearm component were found. Yet even with this theory, questions remained. If Jason had discovered the affair, was his involvement driven by anger, revenge, or something more calculated? Was Kelly a participant, a bystander, or a manipulator? And most crucially, where was Chris Regan's body? Without it, the case was strong but incomplete. In the weeks that followed, the searches intensified. Cadaver dogs were brought in to sweep the wooded area, their handlers watching closely for any change in behavior. More land was combed, more interviews conducted, and the digital forensic work continued in parallel. Every data point, every small discovery was mapped against the timeline. Slowly, the once fragmented puzzle began to take shape. But as each new piece of evidence came into view, the complexity of the case deepened. The Cochrans had built a shared life, and unraveling the truth meant untangling years of history, secrets, and possibly shared complicity. The basement floor, once an unremarkable slab of concrete, had become the silent witness that refused to lie. What investigators had now was not just evidence, but momentum. And in a case where time had been working against them from the start, that momentum was everything. The discovery of blood in the Cochran home and physical items in the woods had transformed suspicion into probable cause. The hunt for answers was no longer abstract. It had a focus, a direction, and the first undeniable proof that Chris Regan had met with violence. The next challenge would be breaking through the final barrier, getting either Kelly or Jason to tell the full story of what had happened in that house, and why. Privately, detectives began to weigh a new theory. If Jason had known about the affair and resented it, and if Kelly had been unwilling to end it on her own, the possibility arose that the couple could have confronted Chris together. Whether that confrontation was planned or spontaneous remained unclear, but the dynamics of the triangle had the potential to explain motive. Pressure on Kelly increased. The inconsistencies in her story were noted, and each new interview chipped away at her earlier denials. She maintained that she had no role in harming Chris, insisting she last saw him alive when he left her company. But her inability to explain why he would end up in her home, or why his blood would be on her basement floor, was becoming an insurmountable gap in her defense. By now, the affair was no longer just a personal detail. It was a motive investigators could articulate with growing confidence. And with motive, means, and opportunity beginning to align. The case was tightening around the Cochrans. What remained was to break through the barrier of silence and find the missing piece that could place one or both of them directly at the scene at the moment Chris Regan's life came to an end. In the aftermath of Chris's disappearance, the Cochran marriage began to fracture under the weight of suspicion and secrecy. Jason's health, already poor due to long-standing medical issues, was visibly declining. Friends noted that he had lost weight, seemed constantly fatigued, and had withdrawn from his usual routines. At the same time, Kelly's demeanor was changing in subtler ways. She appeared more guarded, yet strangely restless, as if carrying a burden she could neither fully hide nor share. By late 2015, the couple had relocated to Indiana, a move that puzzled both neighbors and investigators. To police, it had the look of a retreat, an attempt to put distance between themselves and the place where Chris had last been seen. But distance did not erase suspicion. The Michigan investigators maintained contact with their Indiana counterparts, making sure the case stayed active across state lines. It was in Indiana that the first crack appeared. Jason, increasingly isolated and dependent on Kelly, began confiding in a small circle of acquaintances. Some of what he said was incoherent, the product of illness and stress. But buried in these ramblings were fragments that caught people's attention, references to something terrible that had happened back in Michigan, mentions of blood and promises, and dark hints about never being able to undo what was done. When word of these comments reached law enforcement, detectives recognized the significance. They requested that anyone hearing such remarks take note and, if possible, encourage Jason to speak more openly. The hope was that his physical decline and emotional strain might loosen his grip on the truth. For a time, it seemed like the plan might work, until Jason's health deteriorated so sharply that meaningful conversation became almost impossible. Then, in early 2016, Jason was found dead. The official cause was listed as a heroin overdose, but the circumstances were troubling. He had no documented history of drug abuse, and those who knew him well said the idea of him using heroin was completely out of character. To investigators, his death was not just tragic, it was suspicious. And their suspicions turned squarely toward Kelly. At this point, the case could have taken a darker turn into speculation and dead ends. But it didn't, because shortly after Jason's death, Kelly's behavior shifted dramatically. She began speaking more freely, almost compulsively, as if the secret she had carried for years could no longer be contained. At first, these admissions came in the form of vague, self-pitying remarks to friends, claims that she had been trapped in a toxic marriage, that Jason had made her do things, and that she had been living with guilt ever since. It was one of these conversations that became the breakthrough. In a moment of apparent candor, Kelly told a friend that Jason had forced her to participate in killing Chris Regan. The friend, stunned by the admission, pressed her for details. Kelly's account was halting but chilling, She claimed that Jason had discovered her affair with Chris and, rather than confront her directly, had devised a plan to lure Chris to their home. Once there, she said, Jason attacked him, and she was ordered to help. The friend wasted no time contacting law enforcement. Within days, investigators had arranged to meet with Kelly in a controlled interview setting. Their approach was careful. They didn't confront her with a friend's report immediately. Instead, they revisited earlier questions about the night Chris disappeared, subtly introducing inconsistencies in her past statements. The strategy was to make her realize they already knew far more than she had admitted. Under this sustained pressure, Kelly began to waver. Her responses became less precise, her tone more defensive. Detectives could see the shift. She was no longer in full denial mode. She seemed to be negotiating with herself, weighing how much she could reveal without fully incriminating herself. That was when they brought up Jason's alleged role directly, framing it as something they already understood and inviting her to clarify. The opening worked. Kelly started speaking in greater detail, describing how Chris had been invited to the house under the pretense of spending time with her. Once he arrived, Jason emerged from another room and attacked him. Kelly claimed she froze at first, then complied when Jason ordered her to help restrain Chris. She alleged that the killing was quick, though the forensic evidence suggested otherwise. Her story was that she had no choice, that Jason had threatened her if she refused to participate. For detectives, this was a pivotal moment. While Kelly's account still painted her as a reluctant participant, it was an admission that placed her at the scene and involved in the crime. Crucially, it also confirmed that Chris's death had occurred in the Cochran home, which aligned with the blood evidence found in the basement. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that Kelly was trying to control the narrative. She positioned herself as a victim of coercion, emphasizing Jason's anger and dominance. Yet the fact that she had not come forward earlier, even after moving out of state, undermined that portrayal. Detectives noted her tendency to omit or gloss over certain time frames, particularly the hours immediately following Chris's death. As the interviews concluded, one thing was clear. Chris Regan's disappearance was no longer a mystery of absence. It was now a documented act of violence, tied to a tangled web of betrayal, jealousy, and complicity. And with Jason dead, the full weight of responsibility, and the prospect of a courtroom reckoning, would fall on Kelly Cochran alone. Once Kelly Cochran's partial confession was on record, the investigation shifted into a new, more urgent phase, finding the remains of Chris Regan. For nearly 2 years, his disappearance had been marked by absence. No body, no final resting place, only scattered clues and lingering grief. Now, with Kelly's admission that Chris had been killed in the Cochran home, detectives had a starting point. But her account of what happened after the killing was vague, fragmented, and, at times, deliberately evasive. They began with targeted searches of the areas Kelly had mentioned. Weeks into the renewed search, there was still no breakthrough. Then investigators revisited something they had initially overlooked: Jason Cochran's work history. He had once been employed in construction and had occasionally taken side jobs that involved moving heavy materials to remote properties. This raised the possibility that he had access to locations far off the grid, places few people knew existed. Detectives began quietly interviewing people who had worked with Jason in the months before Chris's disappearance. One remembered Jason mentioning an old hunting camp deep in the woods, a place he said was good for being alone. Another recalled that Jason had once borrowed equipment for digging, though he returned it without explanation. These accounts were not proof, but they gave the search teams new coordinates to consider. The break came during a follow-up interview with Kelly. Detectives, careful to avoid revealing how much they knew, casually mentioned the hunting camp. Kelly's reaction was immediate, a slight stiffening in her posture, a hesitation before responding. It was subtle, but to seasoned investigators, it was telling. They pressed her gently, suggesting that perhaps Jason had taken Chris's body there. Kelly didn't confirm it outright, but she didn't deny it either. With that lead, the search teams redirected their efforts. The camp was accessible only by a narrow, rutted trail that required four-wheel drive vehicles. Once there, the investigators found a small clearing with the remains of an old cabin, its roof caved in from years of neglect. Behind it, a slope led down toward a marshy area thick with reeds and cattails. Cadaver dogs were brought in immediately, and within minutes, they alerted to a spot near the tree line. Forensic specialists began a careful excavation, removing soil layer by layer. A few inches down, they found the first sign, a small fragment of bone. The discovery shifted the atmosphere from cautious optimism to focused urgency. Over the next several hours, more bone fragments emerged, along with personal items later identified as belonging to Chris Regan. Among them was a piece of clothing with a distinctive pattern his friends instantly recognized. DNA testing would later confirm what investigators already knew in their hearts: they had found Chris. For Chris's family, the news was both devastating and, in a grim way, a relief. After years of uncertainty, they finally had an answer to the question that had haunted them. The answer was not one they had wanted, but it allowed them to begin the process of mourning with the dignity of a proper burial. For investigators, the discovery was more than a moment of closure. It was the final piece of leverage they needed against Kelly Cochran. By the time the recovery was complete, the case had shifted from the realm of uncertainty into one of undeniable fact. And now, with the remains in evidence, the path was clear for prosecutors to pursue the only outcome the investigation had been building toward from the start, which is the justice Chris deserved. But forensic evidence alone was not enough. Prosecutors wanted to dismantle Kelly's shifting accounts piece by piece. To do this, they turned to her recorded interviews. Audio analysts reviewed every word she had spoken to law enforcement since the day she was first questioned. They highlighted moments where her tone shifted, where her pauses were too long, where she made subtle contradictions between one statement and the next. These inconsistencies would serve a dual purpose: to show a pattern of deception and to undermine her credibility before the jury. Throughout this process, prosecutors also explored motive. They believed the killing was not random but the result of a twisted pact between Kelly and Jason. According to Kelly, she said herself and Jason agreed to a marriage pact, which they agreed to kill anyone who threatened their relationship. The theory was chilling but supported by both circumstantial evidence and snippets from Kelly's own words. In one recorded conversation, she referred to their relationship as an agreement to handle things together, no matter what. The prosecution planned to present this as a euphemism for murder, framing Chris Regan's death as a calculated act, not a moment of rage. The emotional dimension of the case was carefully considered as well. Prosecutors knew that juries often responded strongly to the human cost of a crime. They worked closely with Chris's family, preparing them for the difficult testimony ahead. Photographs of Chris, alive, smiling, full of plans for the future, were selected to contrast sharply with the cold reality of his remains. The goal was not to exploit grief, but to remind the jury that Chris was not just a name in a file. He was a man whose life had been stolen. Meanwhile, Kelly Cochran's legal team prepared their defense. They hinted at an alternative narrative in which Jason had acted alone, framing Kelly as a reluctant participant coerced by fear. But prosecutors anticipated this and had already built counterarguments. They would show how Kelly had multiple opportunities to seek help and never did, how she had lied repeatedly, and how physical evidence tied her directly to the crime scene and disposal site. As the trial date approached, the courtroom became a staging ground for strategy. In parallel, investigators combed through any remaining loose ends, determined that no overlooked detail could be exploited by the defense. One such detail was the purchase history of certain tools and cleaning supplies. Receipts placed both Kelly and Jason at a hardware store less than 24 hours after Chris was last seen alive, buying bleach, plastic sheeting, and heavy-duty gloves. Surveillance footage from the store showed them together, calm and deliberate in their selection, a quiet but damning image of premeditation. By the final weeks before trial, the case file had grown into a massive archive. Every page, every photograph, every sworn statement was indexed and cross-referenced. The lead prosecutor described it as building a house brick by brick. There can't be any missing pieces, or the whole thing risks collapse. With the evidence now layered and interconnected, they were ready to move forward. When the day finally came to formally charge Kelly Cochran with the murder of Chris Regan, the announcement was made in a packed press conference. The courtroom in Iron County, Michigan, filled each morning with reporters, local residents, and the family and friends of Chris Regan. Kelly entered the courtroom flanked by deputies, dressed in plain civilian clothing rather than the orange of the county jail. Her face betrayed little, expressionless, almost defiant, but her eyes scanned the room in short, deliberate glances. She did not look toward Chris's family, who sat in a tight row directly behind the prosecution's table. Their presence was steady, silent, and unyielding, a reminder of why this trial was taking place. The opening statements set the tone. The prosecutor began with a simple sentence that landed heavily in the quiet room. This case is about betrayal, premeditation, and the calculated ending of a man's life. From there, they laid out their theory, that Kelly and her husband Jason had lured Chris Regan into their home under the guise of a social visit, and once he was inside, carried out a prearranged plan to kill him. Every step after that, the cleanup, the disposal of his remains, the lies told to police, was part of a joint effort to conceal the crime. Kelly's defense took a markedly different approach. They did not deny that Chris was dead, nor that his remains had been found. Instead, they painted Kelly as a woman trapped in an abusive marriage, coerced into compliance by a controlling and violent husband. According to their version, Jason alone had killed Chris, and Kelly's involvement had been born of fear, not malice. This framing positioned her as both a participant and a victim, a risky but calculated narrative designed to humanize her before the jury. By the time the prosecution rested, the case they had presented was like a structure built brick by brick, dense, interconnected, and difficult to dismantle. The defense mounted their argument, calling a handful of witnesses to support the theory of coercion. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom emptied into the quiet corridors of the courthouse. Hours passed. The families waited in separate rooms, the weight of anticipation pressing down on both sides. Late in the day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The crowd reassembled, the room hushed except for the shuffle of papers and the quiet rustle of clothing. As the foreperson rose, the words were clear and deliberate, guilty on all counts. The verdict brought a visible release from Chris Regan's family. Tears, quiet embraces, the long-delayed acknowledgement that justice, in its legal form, had been served. Kelly Cochran showed little outward reaction, her expression as unreadable as it had been on the first day. The prosecution sought the maximum penalties available under state law given the premeditation finding. The defense urged mercy, citing claims of coercion and psychological manipulation. In Michigan, the court imposed life without the possibility of parole for the murder conviction, followed by additional years for related counts. In a separate proceeding in Indiana, arising from Jason Cochran's death and related investigations, Kelly later received an additional lengthy sentence that cumulatively extended her time in custody by decades. Those sentences closed the legal chapters of the case, but they did not resolve every question investigators and victims still carried. The unraveling of the case didn't just expose the violent deaths of two men. It revealed a disturbing psychological portrait of Kelly Cochran. She was a woman who could shift between charm and cold detachment in an instant, who could present herself as cooperative while withholding key facts, and who seemed capable of building, and then dismantling, entire narratives to suit her needs. By the time the court process reached its conclusion, the story that began with one man's disappearance had spiraled into a chilling exploration of trust betrayed, violence concealed, and the dangerous capacity for cruelty that can hide in plain sight. For those who worked the case, the broader unraveling was a reminder that the end of a trial doesn't always mean the end of an investigation. There were still leads to follow, still questions to ask, and still the haunting possibility that there were other victims aside Chris and Jason. And that's all we have for today's episode. I want to thank you all for being here. I truly appreciate your support to this channel. Please do well to leave a like. Also subscribe so you do not miss our upcoming episodes. I will be seeing you soon on our next episode. Until then, stay well and stay safe.